Mystical Space Typhoon negates. No, it does not negate its target. Instead, it negates unfavorable game states and the unending agony of life. Welcome to Yu-Gi-Oh! And Business Casual. I am your host, the one, the only, the RJB0. Don't judge me. I have a convention coming up.
Having a good time, having a good time.
Alright guys, today we are going to be doing a little bit of MST theory because this format requires us to do a little bit of a refresher. So I am going to start off by talking about how many MSTs you should be running and when you should not run MSTs in a format. Then I'm going to talk about how and when to use your Mystical Space Typhoons, including when it is appropriate to blind space your opponent. So let's start with when you should run MST, when you should not, and how many you should run. Generally, you see MSTs disappear from the main deck during faster formats, when there are fewer continuous spell and trap cards being used. For instance, in the Dragon Ruler format, the first Dragon Ruler format, you stopped seeing Mystical Space Typhoon quite as often, because players weren't running a whole lot of continuous spell and trap cards that were going to be a threat to the Dragon Ruler deck. Even if they did have a continuous spell or trap card, Dragon Rulers usually had a fairly strong out to them in the form of Blaster, even if they did not have MST in the main deck. So MST was not as prominent back then. However, in some faster formats, you're going to be seeing some continuous spell and trap card use. And that's why a better gauge than the speed of a format is the amount that continuous spell and traps are being used. Because you do see slower formats in which Mystical Space Typhoon isn't necessarily an appropriate card to have in your main deck, because the majority of your use of Mystical Space Typhoon in the main deck in Game 1 is going to be blind MSTing, because your opponent isn't running that many continuous spell and trap cards. So the right gauge to follow for MST is how many spell and trap cards your opponent is going to be running that MST would stop that will be a problem for your deck. For instance, if your opponent is only running Fiendish Chains and your deck isn't hurt that much by Fiendish Chain, it wouldn't be appropriate to run MST because you are not likely to have a smart use for it. That MST could be any better card for your deck. However, in a format like this one, where you might see Fiendish Chains and Vanity's Emptiness and Dimensional Fissure and things like that, it is appropriate to run more MSTs. I generally consider that if there is a card that is fairly common that my deck is going to have trouble with or that's going to stop my plays, even temporarily, I want to run enough MSTs that I will have it consistently in my hand when that play comes up. For instance, if my opponent is likely to be running 2 Vanity's Emptiness in the main deck, I generally assume this format that they're going to be running 3 because that just seems to be the trend, and it seems to be a safer assumption than not. But in a format where people are likely to just be running 2 Vanity's Emptiness or 2 Fiendish Chain or something like that, I'm only going to run 2 MSTs, and that's the amount that I want to go with. I want to receive my MSTs just as often as my opponent is going to get their continuous spell or trap card outs to my MSTs, and that kind of brings us to the theory of when you should use MSTs. The general theory about when you should use your Mystical Space Typhoons says don't use them. You don't want to use your Mystical Space Typhoons unless you absolutely have to, because if you use them on a superfluous card, like if I'm playing Shadows and my opponent goes for Tenki, it's not going to be a problem for me. That would be a waste of my MST. Or if I am playing, say, a Hand Artifact Trap Tricks build and my opponent Fiendish Chains a monster, that's a bad time to use an MST because MST isn't doing a whole lot for you. It's pushing a playthrough that isn't going to help you very much in the long run. You want to save them for floodgate cards like the Vanity's Emptiness. So I generally say that I do not use my MSTs until a floodgate card comes up or until a continuous spell or trap card stops an extremely crucial play. So if my opponent is Fiendish Chaining my tour guide and that is the only play that I have available to me, MST is an appropriate card to use then. But if my opponent is Fiendish Chaining my tour guide and I have 2 Burning Abyss monsters in my hand and no back row, that's a bad time to use that MST because I can still make a play and I can still get yet another tour guide, most likely if I'm running Burning Abyss in that case, during the next turn. So you want to save your MSTs until you absolutely have to use them. But there are exceptions to this rule. For instance, if you are winning a game If you are doing really well against your opponent, if you're in extremely favorable game state and you think you can push through the final damage that you need to lock in that game, whether it's the amount to get your opponent down below a soul charge limit depending on the deck, or whether you're getting in the range of like a cowboy or something like that, then sometimes it is appropriate to blindly MST. And there are two ways in which it can be appropriate to blindly MST. If you know you can OTK next turn, and you want to simplify the game state by reducing the number of spell and trap cards your opponent could possibly use to disrupt your play, then blind MSTing during the end phase of your opponent's turn is a good idea, because it means that if you can push through that really important play without the worry of as many trap cards, then that's a great thing, because say you have a lance or a wiretap or something like that, there are fewer cards that your opponent can use after you use that lance or wiretap or enchain to them in order to make sure that your play doesn't go through. So that's an appropriate time to blindly MST. Another appropriate time to blindly MST is when your opponent has back row and you're in a favorable game state and your opponent sets a back row. Oftentimes, if your opponent already had back row and you have a favorable game state, it means that back row is dead. Because if you have the favorable game state and your opponent let you go through with that, chances are that those back row cards aren't going to stop your big plays. But then if your opponent sets a further back row card, and you know that you have a big push that you can make next turn, it is appropriate to MST that new back row card, because that card is more likely to be alive than the other, say, 3 pieces of back row that your opponent has been holding on to this entire time. So that's kind of just some general advice on how to use your Mystical Space Typhoons. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule, but that is a general rule to go by. So I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, hit that thumbs up button. If you did, let me know why in the comment section below. And of course, subscribe for more decks, discussion, analysis, and general Yu-Gi-Oh! Shenanigans. My next discussion video is going to be more stuff about MSTing and things like that, in which I talk about the difference and the advantages and disadvantages between Dust Tornado over Twister. So stick around for that. Meanwhile, thank you guys for watching. I'm your host, the RJB0, and if you didn't get any of the references at the beginning of this video, then do yourself a favor and click on a link in the description below and take yourself to the Welcome to Night Vale podcast and have some fun listening to that for about an hour. It's pretty great. I'll see y'all later. Bye.